Hey there, it's DeadEye here, and I recently watched the new Color Out of Space movie. Now, I'm actually like I would say a casual fan, well, more casual than others, I suppose. A casual fan of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. I've read many of the more well-known stories and some of a couple of lesser-known ones. I don't have exactly have an encyclopedic knowledge of all the elder gods and the old ones and things like that. I do find it fascinating, but just disclaimer: I'm not exactly the most knowledgeable on it. That said, I am a big fan of the story Color Out of Space. It's not a Cthulhu mythos story as such, although of course it has the same sort of stuff in it. The cosmic horror, just horror from beyond our galaxy and things like that. But I was really looking forward to this, not just because of the fact that it's based on a Lovecraft story that I really like. It's also written and directed by a man many may not have heard of, and it's Richard Stanley. And Richard Stanley, he's been kind of off the radar for a very long time. I think he did music videos for a long time, but he is responsible for two of my favourite cult movies in particular. One is a film called Hardware, which is a sort of a kind of a post-apocalyptic, cyberpunk horror film in a way, which is about a killer robot, basically. It's pretty cool. It's got Iggy Pop and it's got Lemmy in it very briefly, but that's for another video. He also made a film called Dust Devils, which, again, a topic for another time. Excellent movies. But after, I think he made another film, it was a musical or something, which I never saw. But I think after that, he kind of dropped off the radar. Especially, I think it was after his ill-fated attempt at making an Island of Dr. Moreau movie, which resulted in the famous John Frankenheimer disaster film, which I've actually yet to see. I've only ever read about it. In fact, it's a film that's purportedly so bad that in the vein of Troll 2, it ended up with its own documentary about it called Lost Souls, which of course I've yet to see as well. But Richard Stanley is apparently interviewed in it, and I'll definitely be getting around to that. But yes, I was very excited to hear that Richard Stanley was back and that he was adapting Lovecraft. And not only that, it's done by the producers of the film Mandy, which I would recommend as well. It's just a strange movie, quite Lynchian, about a man whose wife is kidnapped and murdered by some kind of strange cult, and he just goes on this sort of hallucinogenic journey of revenge against them. And like any movie that has Nicolas Cage having a chainsaw fight is worth watching, so just check it out, okay? But it's made by the producers of Mandy, and of course it also stars Nicolas Cage, which is one of my favourite actors of all time. Anyone with taste, of course, loves Nicolas Cage. So for those of us who are in it for the Cage, anyway, you won't be disappointed. He has his freak out moments, But the story of the Color Out of Space is basically you've got a family who they live in this sort of isolated house, and they have like their own farm and things like that. And one day a meteorite lands near their house, and then it kind of vanishes, sort of strangely. Mysteriously after that, and it emits a color that no one it's not really describable. It's a color that no one's ever really seen before. Of course, in the movie, it's kind of a pinkish color, but it's sort of suggested by some of the characters that they kind of look at it and they don't really know what it is. So, but the afterwards, things start to change, and by change I mean like animals begin to like morph into weird things, like plants begin to grow around them, plants that are a color that no one has ever really seen before, and well, things start to die. Really, it's a very bleak story. Like I say, you should read the Lovecraft story. It's very bleak, and this movie, as such, is quite bleak. Uh, there's a lot of stuff in it that's, I would say, very reminiscent of John Carpenter's The Thing. It is a very 80s style movie. It looks good. It's a lovely looking movie, and it's very kind of it's not, it doesn't look the way that you would see a lot of like movies on Netflix now, like the Netflix uh, style of look nowadays, which is very kind of it's kind of muted, and I would say actually my friend Chris actually stated that they're almost too perfect looking in a way, like it's sort of good looking, perfect looking, but with very little soul. This film is good looking, and it has a lot of colour to it. It's very vibrant, and it's not something you see a lot of in modern horror films. But it's got a very kind of 80s vibe to it, and I don't mean in the way that a lot of movies nowadays where they try to get that 80s look, where it's they've got the synth wave music and things like that, and it's quite obvious that they're doing a pastiche. This film actually feels, in my opinion, like an 80s movie, and I applaud it quite greatly for that. And it's quite hard to adapt a Lovecraft story, really. It's hard to get that atmosphere when you're reading a Lovecraft story, that kind of weird feeling that you get from the prose. So I quite applaud the fact that Richard Stanley has taken this story and kind of really done his own thing with it. It's still the story. It's still the it's still based on, it's still the story that it's based on, but of course it has Nicolas Cage doing his freak out moments, and it's like I say, it's a bit more of it's a bit more of an 80s style film in the vein of John Carpenter's The Thing, and of course John Carpenter's The Thing is one of my favourite movies. So any film that manages to quote that, I would say, rather than, I mean, it certainly doesn't rip it off, but to quote it in that way, of course, is going to be a good thing for me. Some of the creatures in this film, like there are alpacas in this film, which I wasn't expecting, but what happens to them is quite memorable, as well as the mother and the small child of the family. That what happens to them is quite disturbing, really. It is a disturbing movie, but it has a sense of humour, unlike a lot of horror films nowadays, unlike a lot of films nowadays, really. And even when nowadays, like, something has a sense of humour, it's not very funny. It doesn't really work that well. This film works very well. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else to really go over with this film. I love the fact that Tommy Chong is in it. Tommy Chong basically plays a sort of hippie type guy that lives out in the woods, off the grid and everything. And he has some great moments, particularly towards the end of the film, where he has a sort of monologue which is actually quite creepy. And so I highly recommend this one. And I'll tell you something, I mean, I was pretty psyched for this film, but knowing now that Richard Stanley is apparently planning a Lovecraft trilogy, with this one being the opening one, and the next one apparently being an adaptation of the Dunwich horror quite frankly, shut up and take my fucking money. Because Dunwich Horror is probably among my favourites of the Lovecraft stories that I've read. I cannot wait. I want to see a Shoggoth on screen. I know the Dunwich Horror has been adapted before. I've never seen it. It's the one with, I think it had Dean Stockwell from Quantum Leap in it, but I've been told kind of mixed things about it. Chris tells me it's kind of dull. But I am very much psyched for a Dunwich Horror adaptation by Richard Stanley. So yes, I highly recommend The Colour Out of Space. Check it out. I also recommend Richard Stanley's previous work, particularly Hardware and Dust Devils, if you can track down copies of those. They are great, unsung little cult horror films. And yeah, so there we go. Thank you very much. I am DeadEye, and I hope you don't rot in hell. I guess. Thanks.